The sack was tied too tight around her neck. Canvas damp from sweat. No eye holes. No mercy. The auctioneer didn't ask her name. Didn't say where she was from. Just shouted over the crowd. Wife material. Strong hips, good bones, and already trained to silence. Laughter. Coins clinked in cups. Some men jeered. Others stared like they were picking out horses. One even whistled when she flinched under the sun. But the man who stepped forward didn't say a word. Just held up $3 silver. The crowd chuckled. Big spender, someone called. Hope she ain't ugly under that thing. He didn't respond. Just handed over the coins. And took her hand. She didn't resist. Didn't speak. Just walked beside him like she'd already died once and didn't see the point of resisting a second time. They didn't speak until nightfall. And even then, she said just one word. Her name. And that was the moment everything changed. But to understand what made that moment matter, you have to know the kind of man who paid $3 for a stranger. And why he meant it. They called him Ellis Boone. 42. Bearded. Quiet. Carried the weight of the northern woods in his shoulders. Lived in a single-room cabin 10 miles past where most folks bothered to settle. No wife. No children. Just trees. Just timber. He cut wood for the Union Pacific Railroad. Lived off jerky, whiskey, and hard silence. Folks in town said he hadn't spoken more than 10 words in 5 years. Not since his brother died in a mill accident and left behind a debt Ellis never stopped paying off. In labor, in guilt, in loneliness. He didn't go to church. Didn't go to town dances. Didn't write letters. He just worked. Until he overheard a man in the saloon talking about a wagon load of surplus women headed west from Missouri. A makeshift bride auction planned by rail bosses who figured wives might tame the miners and lumbermen. No names. No past. No questions. Ellis didn't plan on going. He hadn't touched a woman since the war. Hadn't even looked one in the eye since his mother died. But something in the way that drunk laughed. They ain't even letting him talk till they're sold. Stuck in his mind like a splinter. That night, he sat in his cabin with the fire low and the shadows long. He thought of his ma, soft-spoken, calloused hands. Thought of his sister-in-law, who used to hum lullabies while hauling buckets from the well. He thought of how silence, forced long enough, becomes its own kind of death. And in the morning, he saddled his mule and rode to the dusty yard behind the freight depot. There were 9 women, all with sacks over their heads. They stood barefoot in a row. Dust rose with every shuffle of their feet. The men circled like wolves. The auctioneer smirked, slapping one on the back. Pick quick, boys. No refunds. Ellis watched from the edge, arms crossed, heart somewhere between his ribs and the rifle at his back. And then she stepped forward. Just a half step. Just enough to make her sack shift. Reveal a lock of dark hair soaked in sweat. Just enough to show a wrist, bruised at the seam where rope had once been tied too long. The crowd didn't notice, but Ellis did, and something in his chest went still. Not pity, not desire, recognition. She'd already been claimed by silence, but not broken by it. He didn't speak when he paid, didn't touch her roughly when he took her hand, just led her to his mule, helped her mount gently, and walked beside her out of town while the other men drank and laughed behind them. She never asked where they were going. He never told her. Until the sun slipped behind the trees and they stopped by a stream where the frogs had already begun to sing. He untied the sack. Slowly. Gently. She didn't fight it. When the canvas came off, she blinked up at him, face streaked with dirt and dried tears. Not beautiful in the way poems described, but real. Strong. Eyes like coals buried deep in ash. He didn't flinch. He didn't stare. He just knelt by the stream and filled the canteen. And when he handed it to her, she took a single sip, wiped her mouth and whispered, "Clara." That was all. Just a name. Just a word. But it shook something loose inside him. He looked at her, really looked, and said the first full sentence he'd spoken in nearly half a decade. "Clara, if you'll have me, I won't ever make you beg again." She didn't answer. Not right away. But she held the canteen with both hands like it was the first thing in months that had been given, not taken. And for Ellis Boone, That was enough. Ellis hadn't brought a second saddle. He rode the mule. Clara walked beside him. He offered to switch once. She shook her head. Walking makes me feel real, she said softly. And I want to feel real again. They didn't speak much after that. The trail north twisted through pine groves and narrow gulches, all cloaked in a silence deeper than words. When they reached the cabin, half hidden by wind-warped trees and wrapped in the scent of old sap and cedar, Clara paused just outside the door. "This is yours?" she asked. Ellis nodded. She didn't step in right away. He waited. Finally, she said, "I didn't think there'd be trees. Where I came from, the land was dry, flat." He stepped back and let her walk in first. The place wasn't much. One bed, a stove, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, kettle, a Bible no one opened anymore, a tin box full of dull sewing needles. But to Clara, it might as well have been a palace. She touched the edge of the table, ran her hand over the bed frame, then turned toward him slowly. "Is this where I stay?" Ellis stared at her for a long moment, then pulled a blanket from the trunk and tossed it onto the floor beside the fire. "I don't touch what ain't offered," he said simply. She nodded, didn't argue, didn't explain. She just sat down and let out the kind of sigh that people only breathe when no one's expecting anything from them anymore. The next day, trouble came from town. Not a posse, not lawman, preacher. Tall, thin, boots polished too clean for mud country. He rode up midday, Bible in one hand, something mean in the other. Ellis was chopping wood when he heard the hoofbeats. Clara was inside, sweeping sawdust from the corners. The man dismounted slow. "Ellis Boone," the preacher said with a polite nod. "Heard you made a purchase yesterday." Ellis set the axe down, wiped sweat from his brow. Didn't know the church kept records on commerce. The preacher didn't smile. Some of those girls were spoken for. Clara, she belonged to Mr. Merritt in Kansas City, a mining investor, paid good money for her travel west. Ellis crossed his arms. "She say that?" The preacher hesitated. "She doesn't need to. The papers say so." "She ain't property," Ellis growled. "She was paid for," the preacher said smoothly. "And now Mr. Merritt expects her back. He sent me ahead to retrieve her. I'd prefer not to make a scene." Ellis looked toward the cabin. The door was cracked. Clara stood just behind it, still quiet, listening. Ellis turned back to the preacher. "You ride all the way out here just to take a woman back to the man who put a sack on her head and sold her like cattle?" "She was compensated," the preacher snapped. "Shelter, food, safety. She had more than most." Ellis took a slow step forward. The preacher's words trailed off. "I'll tell you what she had," Ellis said, voice low. "She had rope burns on her ankles. She had bruises on her thighs. She had silence shoved down her throat so hard she forgot her own name." The preacher's eyes flicked to the axe still buried in the stump. "You'd risk your neck for a whore?" Ellis didn't flinch. "Call her that again," he said, "and you won't ride back." The preacher's jaw tightened. He stepped backward toward his horse. "I'll return with men, with paper. She's not yours. She's not anyone's." The preacher swung into the saddle. "Then God help you, Boone, because you've made yourself a thief." Ellis didn't respond, just stood there, still, like a tree that wouldn't bend. That night, Clara didn't sit on the floor. She sat across from Ellis at the table, hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "I know. They'll say I belong to someone. They'll be wrong." She looked down at her hands, calloused, thin, scarred in places. "Do you want to know what they paid for me?" she asked. "No." She blinked, surprised. "But I don't care what they paid," he said gently. "I care what you want." She was quiet for a long time, then whispered, "No one's ever asked me that before." "You're here now," he said. "I don't know what I want. That's allowed." She looked up at him, eyes full of disbelief, of old wounds not yet scabbed over. And then, almost in a whisper, "I think I want to stay." Ellis reached across the table, slowly, so she could pull back if she needed, and placed his hand over hers. "You can." And just like that, something shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but surely. A promise, spoken in silence. The men came at dawn. 3 of them. Not townsfolk, not law. These were hired hands. One with a crooked tooth and a new rifle. One with gloves too clean for a woodsman. The last had a scar along his jaw that looked earned, not painted. These weren't men who threatened. These were men who finished. Ellis saw them before Clara did. He was feeding the chickens behind the shed when he caught the glint of metal through the tree line. Too smooth to be sunlight on water. He didn't run, didn't shout. He just walked back to the cabin, calm and steady, like a man who'd already decided what kind of story he was willing to die in. Clara met his eyes before he spoke. "They're here." He nodded. She didn't ask who. She didn't have to. Ellis opened the trunk under the bed and pulled out the old Spencer rifle he hadn't fired since his brother's funeral. The metal was cold, the stock worn smooth, but it still clicked when he chambered around. "Do you want me to go out the back?" she asked quietly. "No. I could run. They'd follow. I don't want to be the reason." He turned to her now. His voice was calm, even. "You're not the reason. You're the choice." That landed somewhere deep inside her, somewhere too hollow for words, so she just nodded and stood behind him as the first knock hit the door. Not a loud knock, a slow one, mocking, deliberate. Ellis didn't answer right away. Another knock came, then a voice. "Ellis Boone, we're not here to kill you, just to collect something that ain't yours." Ellis opened the door, rifle in hand. The man with the scar smiled thinly. "You always greet folks with a loaded gun? Only the ones who call people things." Behind Ellis, Clara stepped into view. The man with the gloves whistled. "Well now, ain't she just a picture? You're doing good work out here, Boone. Shame it's stolen." Ellis's finger didn't move. His eyes never blinked. "She's not going anywhere." The one with the rifle cocked his head. "Mr. Merritt paid passage. Paid protection. He don't like losing investments." "She ain't an investment. She was bought. She was abused." The man with the scar shifted slightly. "We don't care about sermons," he said. "We're here for collection. You hand her over, we leave. Nobody bleeds." Ellis looked back at Clara. She met his gaze, then stepped forward beside him. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice steady. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "You think this ends well for you?" She didn't answer, so he looked to Ellis. Last warning in his face. "You got a lot of trees out here," he said. "Plenty of places to bury a body." Ellis stepped forward now. Just one step, enough to close the gap. "You're standing under one," he said. "And if you so much as reach for her, you'll be fertilizer by nightfall." Tension coiled between them. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of pines and a bird calling somewhere too far to help. Then the man with the rifle twitched. Just a flicker of movement. But Ellis didn't wait. The butt of the Spencer rifle cracked against the man's jaw before he could even lift it. He went down hard. The other 2 drew steel. Clara screamed. But Ellis was already moving. The gloved man lunged. Too fast, too confident. And Ellis pivoted, grabbed his coat, and drove him backward into the porch post with a crunch of splintering wood. The man with the scar hesitated. Ellis raised the rifle again, but didn't fire. He didn't need to, because Clara stepped forward now, holding the cast-iron kettle hot and heavy, and slammed it against the side of the man's head with a cry that came from someplace older than memory. He dropped, hard. The only sound after that was her breathing, ragged, fierce, alive. Ellis looked at her. She looked back. She was shaking. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "I thought I'd be afraid," she whispered. "Are you?" "No." They didn't bury the men. They tied them, left them by the edge of the trail with a broken gun and a warning pinned to a tree. She chose her life. "Come again and I'll end yours." By sunset they were gone, carried off by their own fear, and the knowledge that this wasn't the kind of cabin you could break into without bleeding. That night, Ellis didn't sleep. Neither did Clara. They sat by the fire, backs against the wall, hands clasped quietly. No words, just warmth, and the understanding that danger hadn't passed, only changed its shape. But for now they were still standing. And they were standing together. The morning after the men were driven off, it rained. Not the heavy kind that soaks a roof through, just the soft, steady kind that silences birds and turns dust into breathing soil. Clara stepped out into it without her shawl, barefoot, letting the water soak her dress, her hair, her skin. Ellis watched her from the doorway. He didn't speak. She stood in the clearing with her palms turned upward, eyes closed. He thought maybe she was praying. But after a while, she turned and said, "It's the first time in years I've felt like I belong to myself." He didn't know what to say to that, so he stepped outside too, and stood beside her. The rain washed quietly over them both, and neither of them moved. That afternoon, she found an old dress in the trunk, one his mother had worn before she died. It was plain, faded, a little too long, but Clara cleaned it, stitched the torn hem, and wore it with a pride that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with ownership. When Ellis saw her in it, he paused in the middle of chopping wood. She looked at him shyly, brushing a lock of damp hair behind her ear. "I thought maybe if I looked like someone who belongs here, I might believe it myself." He set down the axe, walked to her slow, then said, "You don't need to look like anything." Clara swallowed. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been called so many names, Ellis. Things I won't repeat." He nodded. "I've been called things too. You. I used to drink hard, fight harder, before the woods took me in, before silence saved me." She tilted her head. "You were saving yourself?" He nodded again. "Didn't realize it until I saw you." She took a long breath. "I used to think I was only valuable when I was useful to a man." He didn't flinch. "I used to think I was only decent when I was alone." They stood a long while in that quiet. Not ashamed, not afraid, just honest. And then she said, "If I asked you something, would you promise to answer true?" "I always will." She stepped closer now, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath on his collarbone. "Would you have married me, even with the sack still on my head?" He didn't look away. "Yes. Even if I never touched you?" "Yes. Even if I had nothing left to give?" His answer came like thunder before the storm. "You gave me peace the second you said your name." Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them, they shimmered. Not with tears, but with something weightier, something hard-earned. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead against his chest, and whispered, "Then marry me proper." Ellis didn't need a ring, didn't need a preacher. He just wrapped his arms around her and held her like a man who'd spent half a life lost in the woods and had finally found the clearing. That night, they lit the lantern early. She cooked beans with wild onions. He carved a second chair. And when the fire crackled low and shadows began to sway on the walls, Clara knelt beside the hearth and said, "I used to dream of being rescued." Ellis looked up. "You were." She smiled. "But not by a prince. Not on a horse. Not with a sword." He reached across the space between them, took her hand. "I'm not a prince." "No," she said. "You're just a man who listened, and that's worth more." The wind howled once across the chimney. A coyote barked in the hills. But inside that cabin, nothing stirred but the embers and their shared quiet. And for the first time in years, silence felt like home. They never filed paperwork. There was no church, no priest, no kiss in front of a crowd. But 2 winters later, the townspeople stopped calling her the Sack Girl and started calling her Mrs. Boone. They'd see her once a month when Ellis brought in lumber or traded dried meat. She'd walk beside him with a basket on her hip and a firm voice when merchants tried to cheat him on the weight. "She don't smile much," a shopkeeper once said, but his wife corrected him. "That's 'cause she only smiles when it matters." And it was true. Clara smiled with purpose. When a baby stopped crying, when the hens laid early, when Ellis came in from the woods with cold fingers and she was waiting with hot broth and dry socks. No one knew where she came from, and nobody dared ask. Because by then, even the men who'd once joked about her sack didn't meet her eyes in the street. Not since the time she'd broken a man's finger when he touched her braid without asking. Not since they saw the way Ellis's hand hovered protectively near hers even when he wasn't looking at her. As if he'd spent his whole life learning to leave space for someone to breathe. The cabin grew. Ellis built a second room with a south-facing window. Clara planted sage and lavender out front. Said it made the place smell like memory instead of labor. And though they never had children of their own, lost travelers and runaways always seemed to find their way to their clearing, as if something in the wind whispered safety through the pines. A girl arrived one spring, barefoot, shaking, with a bruise that told more truth than her words ever could. Clara let her sleep in the old wool chair. Didn't ask questions. Just put warm bread in her hands and let her choose silence until it stopped feeling like fear. Another came in the fall, a boy no older than 14, coat too thin for the season. Ellis gave him a hat, carved him a spoon, let him stack firewood until he had enough strength in his shoulders to keep moving. They didn't run an inn, didn't seek people out, but something about that little cabin, and the quiet way Clara stirred her stew while Ellis sharpened his axe, had a way of telling folks, "You are safe here, if only for a while." Years passed. Ellis's beard grew white. Clara's hands grew stiff. The fire burned lower some nights, but they always lit it early, not for warmth, but to chase away the kind of dark that isn't about light at all. One night, she sat beside him by the hearth and asked, "Do you ever wonder who I was before?" He didn't hesitate. "No." She nodded, satisfied. "Why not?" "Because I know who you are now." When Ellis passed, quiet in his chair, his last breath more of a sigh than a struggle, Clara sat beside him for hours. No weeping, no panic, just her hand in his. When morning came, she buried him beneath the tree line, beneath the tallest pine, the one that always caught the first snow. She carved the marker herself. Didn't say husband, didn't say gone. It said, he listened, he stayed, he saw me. She lived another 10 years, grew herbs, sang to birds when no one was around, wrote her name in the margins of books. Sometimes she'd sit on the porch and remember the day the sack came off, how her name had felt like a bell rung in a long-abandoned chapel, how Ellis had looked at her like she was already someone, already whole. And when her time came, it wasn't stormy, it wasn't tragic, it was quiet, like a story ending at just the right sentence. Not with a bang, but with a breath, and the knowledge that being seen once fully was enough to make a life.